Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pretty good attendance, I would say, for a Wednesday morning. Good news is the sun is out, as Paul said. We're very proud to be hosting this as part of London International Shipping Week. To ask the question, are organisations in the marine industry exploiting the power of brand? And I was just saying to the panelists earlier, it's so rare for us as Blue, the PR and communications consultancy, to get the opportunity to talk about stuff we do. I go to a lot of environmental conferences, insurance conferences. There are so many events this week, and I think we may be the only one that really sort of at least dabbles into some sort of vertical around the importance of brand, communications, and so on. And I think it's something that the industry, given that there are hundreds of individuals working in PR, comms, brand, and marketing, needs to do more of. So we're pleased to hopefully begin to start that process. I would like to say a very big thank you to Paul and his team and to Ince for hosting us here. It is really a tremendous venue. So, the panel, to my left, Klavs Valskov. Klavs is Head of Brand, Chief Communications Officer at GE Baker Hughes, and formerly Head of Communications at Maersk. To his left, Yvonne Harley, Head of Communications at V.Group. To Yvonne's left, Richard Meade, who many of you will recognise as editor of Lloyd's List. Someone who needs little introduction, well, to me at least, my fellow director of Blue Communications, Nick Blythe, and then finally, as Paul mentioned, Peermohamed, who is partner and global head of shipping at Ince. From your experience in the industry, do you feel the industry is fully exploiting the power of brand?
The industry is doing well now in progressing towards that ambition, if I may say so. I don't think they've done enough. Some companies have. So for instance, when you think of tankers, you think TK, they're a good brand, and they do exploit that. And similarly with container vessels, you think of Maersk, you think of MSC. These are brands that the market knows well. Cruise liners, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and funnily enough, MSC Cruises are now the #3 cruise company in the world. So there are some companies that do understand the power of brand, and indeed need to understand, because they're listed. If they don't understand it and do enough to promote it, then that will impact on their share price.
And obviously, that's ship owning particularly, but you know there are hundreds of services. Law, of course, is a key service that is provided to the industry. How do you see the wider service providers to the industry competing on brand?
Well, the service providers, as you said, there are numerous, and unfortunately, the vast majority of those companies are quite small in size. So because of their scale, if you like, they haven't had the opportunity to invest as much money as one would like them to. There are some major service providers, law firms, for instance, but having said that, law firms are a little bit different in that individual lawyers tend to be sought out rather than firms. And I think the firm's reputation would probably put them in, say, a third of the way up getting the instruction, but actually the 2/3 of the decision-making process from a client perspective comes from the individual. Do they know that person? Has he or she got a good reputation to fix that particular problem?
I want to come on later to the differentiation between brand and reputation, but Nick, is size necessarily a preventer, if you like, to utilising the power of brand, whether in shipping or elsewhere?
Well, I think you just got to backtrack a bit, because I think, I think the issue, well, I think there's been a lot of change over the past 10 years, And I think as the industry has become more competitive, there's been a real desire for companies to be more visible, to get out there. And there's a lot of pushing communications and content and stuff out into the market, which is good. But my challenge is whether organisations genuinely understand what brand is. You know, it is clearly more than a logo. It is about it's the DNA of the organisation. It's why it exists. It comprises values that should run through, you know, the fabric of an organisation, represented in every department. From the moment that you walk into a building, you should know, you should feel that brand. It should be quite an emotional experience. You know, the challenge is how do you turn those values into behaviours and into processes and systems that drive that. Because, you know, if you do that, then that creates the opportunity to create real, genuine differentiation that provides the foundation for rich and creative and impactful communication that generally influences the people that you want to influence and drives the change that you want within the market. I don't think, and this is a very subjective opinion, but I don't think a lot of organisations do that. I think it's very much more about we need to be out there rather than actually understand. It's almost like they focus on the what, you know, what are we doing within this market, rather than why. Why are we getting out of bed every morning to exist, and what is the difference that we want to make? And I think it's answering that question internally within a business is a fascinating process, and it should be an incredibly enriching process. But I think shipping probably has quite a long way to go to deliver that.
And size, those back to scale and size.
I
think you're a CEO and
I think the smallest company. I mean, you know, we set up a business, and when there was literally sort of 2 or 3 of us in the office, we went through a process of understanding what we stood for, and you know why communications in terms of what we do is genuinely important. I think because if you start at that small scale, then as you grow, hopefully, the values that you represent continue to flourish within an organisation. I think it's a lot easier for owner-managed businesses to do it because, again, subjective statement, certainly the ones I've seen, there tends to be quite a lot of passion because they've probably remortgaged their house and so forth to do it. I think within a larger organisation, it's a lot more difficult.
Just going back to a point that Klavs made, Richard. You know, it resonated with me. You talk about Maersk, MSC, you talk about Carnival. They're either consumer facing, or they are publicly listed. And so there is in our experience certainly, a very shrewd motive in looking after and protecting and building a brand and reputation that marries with that. I mean, if you're a bulk owner, Richard, operating in West Africa, I mean, is there still a prerogative for developing a brand, living your values and in some regards protecting it? Perhaps if you're an owner, you want to protect your reputation and your brand.
It depends, is the journalist answer, I'm afraid. I think, first of all, I'm terrified to hear that a brand should be visible when you walk into the building. I'm thinking back to some of the terrible hellholes that Lloyd's List has been posted in over the years and wondering what that says about the journalist brand. But journalists have a sort of a terrible habit of sort of oversimplifying and being quite crude about this. And you know, I've spoken for many years about the shipping industry's deeply fragmented nature, and I mean, broadly speaking, you can divide most elements of shipping into the good, the bland, and the ugly. And you know, you have a sort of a top tier of the Maersks and you know, of the world where we've got you know, good corporatized companies that do all the right things, and they may not get everything right, but they are certainly sort of on that journey of brand, and they understand the terminology and the semantics of brand. At the bottom, you have the ugly, which you know brand is probably not foremost of their priorities when they wake up in the morning. and unfortunately they will persist. And I think the shipping industry is doing a reasonably good job of chipping away at the bottom end, but the vast majority is sort of the big fragmented mass in the middle. And if you're thinking, specifically just within the ship owning, with the very fragmented bulkers that you mentioned, I mean, out of the 9 to 10,000 shipping companies, ship owning companies worth sort of noting that we followed, around 5,000 of those would fall into the majority, the middle. And we often go back to that statistic of the average ship owner owns about 5.5 ships. That's not a particularly useful statistic, other than sort of explaining that it is deeply fragmented and there is no one-size-fits-all policy within shipping. So you could have a dry bulk owner of great repute operating off of West Africa who is extraordinarily worried about his brand. Is it less likely than a big corporatized blue chip? Yes, it probably is, frankly. But I think we're probably going to get into some of the semantics, and you made the point about brand being the DNA of a company. I think there are many shipping companies that have a very good grasp of what their DNA is. They just don't necessarily call it brand. And the difference between brand and communications and reputation, what you do versus what you say, these are all things that you guys professionally articulate very well. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the vast majority of ship owners don't engage in that thought process, they just don't call it brand.
And that point, we talked a lot about owners, but owners, for me anyway, are only a fragment of the shipping industry, and it's actually the suppliers and service providers to the owners and other entities like them that in many regards probably require understanding and the opportunity of brand more than the owners themselves in many ways. From a ship management perspective, how do you see it?
Okay, so picking up on some of the points, and you're saying about people not necessarily knowing it is brand, and it's called brand. So we've created this brand or brands, if you like, and we've created some mysteriousness around it, and it's almost like an untouchable, and you must have an awful lot of money to invest in this. And actually what it comes down to, in terms it doesn't matter what sector you're in, and I've worked across a number of sectors, probably giving away my age now as well, but it's about the stakeholder, and it's about the experience of the individual stakeholders, whether it be an employee, whether it be a customer, whether it be a supplier. That's what drives it, and that's not requiring a full-page colour advert in a specific trade magazine or having somebody stand on a stage at a conference speaking to your peers. That's really about the operational processes, and whether you've got 10 people in your organisation or whether you've got 10,000 or 100,000, and I've worked for companies of that scale, it still comes down to the basics and the discipline and about consistency and really understanding anything that you do in that space should be delivering a better business outcome for everybody in the chain. Because the impact I've seen when suppliers haven't been paid, you're destroying their business. You're eroding somebody else's value. So it's really about respect as well for me.
And Klavs, great to have you here. Thank you for coming. And I think, whether we like it or not, Maersk are often used as a sort of the immediate example of a shipping industry example, if you like, of utilising the power of brand, of utilising and using communications to great effect. You were there. We were just discussing briefly before. Maersk really was fairly latent prior to 2008, something like that, and then things shifted. And it'd be great, to some degree, I'm sure, for many of us, just to hear what prompted that journey. What was the objective? What prompted that quite sizable shift in the organisation to sort of start investing in brands, start investing in communicating?
So yeah, as you mentioned, I had the privilege of leading communications for Maersk Line from 2008 to 2013, and I think what one of the it was very, let's say, professionally driven. It was driven through merit, I would say. It wasn't sort of a big strategic decisions within Maersk. They said, okay, now we just need to have world-class PR, and now we need to grow on social media and so on. It was sort of a chain of events, if you like. And I joined the organization in about 6 months before the financial crisis hit, and at that time Maersk was already in dire straits because of a number of acquisitions, basically from the mid-90s up through the zeros, which has led to a lot of complexity in the organization at that time, which was sort of not really giving any great results on the bottom line. So the organization was already embarking on a massive transformation of the organizations throughout the functions, moving a lot of, let's say, administrative tasks to shared service centers, and trying to create better customer experience while also fixing a lot of the complexity on the, let's say, financial side. A lot of invoices were erroneous, massive IT complexity and so on, and then the financial crisis hit. And I think we came in, me and at that time a relatively small team, demonstrated how you through great change comms could actually make things go a lot faster. So if you actually explain things well in a large organization at that time, Maersk Line internally, they were about 34,000 people. When I left, we were 25, I think they're further down now. So there's a lot of tough change to go through, and if you still want to maintain a relatively okay customer experience and still want to keep your vessels running and so on, you need to explain people what they need to focus on. What is it that's changing from today and something more? What is it exactly you need to do differently, and how does this fit into your world picture? What's your line of sight? What's going to happen next? And so on. And it was actually through that where we started building the function. And then quite quickly the management would say, okay, if we do this, if we start audience-based, then actually and explain people, instead of explaining what we want them to do, if we start taking point of departure in what they, in them, it was actually through that. And then quite quickly, so the management turned around to me and said, okay, if we give you PR and digital and so on, what we do that, and then quite quickly we had sort of a let's say full, more or less full or complete portfolio, if you will. And from then on, we started sort of working very strategically with, and we didn't really differentiate between internal and external comms. It's the same. I mean, already at that time, social media was really, starting to play a quite significant role in people's lives. So, and people, your employees are reading newspapers as well as your customers. So we didn't really differentiate between internal and comms. So it was really important just to have message alignment across. And that allowed us to move quicker when we wanted to do announcements, when we wanted to change things. And quite quickly, I wouldn't say necessarily that at that time that was under the leadership of Ivan Colling. He quite quickly could really see the value of that. So of course we also had his, where he quite quickly would see, okay, if, and it wasn't because we invested a lot of money in it, to be honest. I think we had a very good partnership. He could see the value, and we were then in return good to sort of come back and say, what are the results? Are things getting through? We start to become more and more proactive in, okay, if these are your strategic initiatives as a business, we need to explain things in a certain way, which then led to we grew our credibility as a more and more of a strategic partner to the leadership, which then gave me space to invest in social media at that time, which nobody in the organization could really see the value of. And I think most of you who work with communications within shipping know the story of social media for Maersk, which became a story of its own. And things also was a much greater success than I could ever have anticipated. But I think a lot of that was simply because we were allowed to experiment. So I had sort of room to experiment and explore, and we got some great results out of it. And today Maersk has some great, fantastic social media platforms. Not always using them in the way that I would, but it's also 3 years since I've been there.
At this juncture, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, Larry Rumble, Parker Kittiway. I think I'm probably the only supplier in the room. I think everybody else is not in a manufacturing situation, but I'll speak. I'd like to concur with a couple of points very quickly. Firstly, that brand is not about size, because I know for a fact that if Mo Farah produced running shoes, it'd be an instant huge company, and that's just one man, so we would all follow that. We've talked a lot about size here, about size of company and grandiose schemes. But also, I would like to just bring the point up that exploiting has two meanings. It's positive, positively taking advantage of the all of the assets available to a company to use them to the full, but it's also possible to do it in a negative way. I think it's important to look at the question, and are indeed organisations in the marine industry, manufacturers, exploiting the power of their brand and not actually giving full service and full quality and everything that's expected, because they're actually leaning on their brand and the legacy of their brand and using it to their own advantage. I think that's an important point. I feel that in many cases today, there are many who rely on the power of their past brand as opposed to their future brand.
And presumably that comes down to actually, to Nick's point, living the brand and your values genuinely.
Yeah, I mean, but then that means the brand is ultimately failed. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the whole point of having or creating a brand is to create some kind of accountability within an organisation. It should kind of define the decision-making process that you make as a business in terms of growth strategy or whatever it might be. You know, and as I said earlier, there needs to be those processes internally that you know, a red flag should be raised.
It needs to be polished. You need to
Sorry?
continually polish the brand.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, brands go. It's about a journey, and it's about. But I think the values that define who you are actually don't necessarily change that much. The proposition that you might have to the market, or the vision that you might have to the market, might adapt. For example, you know, Microsoft. You know, their vision was to have a computer on every desk and in every home. Well, they've kind of pretty much realised that, and I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but the new CEO has developed a new fangled vision that involves the cloud and stuff. But the elements of the values of Microsoft, of that company, will enable it. It will provide the platform to create something that's new. But you should always be going back to actually what you stand for and the reason that you that you exist. Why do you exist?
Well, it's an interesting point. It comes back to this whole piece around the operational procedures. Forget about communications. Think about the responsibility of the organisation. And things always go wrong. You do. You know, as soon as you put humans or technology into the mix, something's going to invariably go wrong. It's how you manage that when something's wrong, whether you admit it, put your hands up. Everything from, you know, your customer charter, for example. What do you do? If you're in financial services as a consumer, you know how your complaints are going to be handled as a consumer. There's an ombudsman, so you have a route to have that resolved. But you know, again, coming from the comms world, everybody talked about Virgin being the ultimate brand. But I knew people who worked there who weren't that happy about the brand. They were disgruntled employees. So that always exists. There's always this, and you know, there's a good example of a brand that's been created really around one person. All right, and people just assumed that that was a great place to work. That was a great business to do. You know, if anyone's had a Virgin phone or they've had broadband, they'll have phoned the call centre with a complaint. They'll have had an issue. For that experience and that bit around, when you say about polishing, I think that's quite negative. That's about, you know, and from a PR perspective, that would go against the code of conduct in terms of how we actually manage a situation, because then it comes down to this responsibility, and we have a responsibility in the industry to do the right thing, and our role is to advise people in business in terms of what that responsibility looks like. And there's always going to be a journalist who's going to know if you have polished something. Isn't that right?
Eventually.
Well, you know, we try our best.
You do well.
It's you know, it's our MO to cut through what is essentially more puff and marketing than essential DNA, shall we say? We go back to this issue of semantics, and I'm not in any way, you know, denying that there is a fundamental core of the brand argument that is a very, very valid one to have. But sometimes when you are dealing with PR and comms, and you're having sort of words like synergies and solutions thrust in your face, you do have to stop and think, what is it that you're actually saying? And there will always be that tension between the job of the journalist to get through the essential nugget of what are you telling me versus somebody who is perhaps polishing more than communicating. And I think that is a thing to behold. It is interesting that the point you make about the shifting strategy, and I think what is quite relevant now for many companies, I said for the likes of V.Group, but across shipping, what we are seeing is an increased corporatization, this increased scale, and you mentioned this at the outset. As this sort of slow march towards scale, by regulation, by customer demand, by access to finance, all of these things are pushing towards an ultimate consolidation, scalability, economies of scale. But then with that comes the corporatization, and certainly some companies like V.Group, which is a conglomeration of what were very smaller, much smaller companies. Each of them had their individual sort of DNA thread through it. So once you become something like V.Group, you regularly, I guess, have to understand what it is that what is the essential soul of something like that, that is so sprawling. And we've got Class here in the room. Class regularly goes through that sort of period of reflexive navel gazing, sort of what are we, what is the nature of class? But that is natural. That is essential in an industry that's got a 300-year history. It's not necessarily a question of the individual sort of quarter-to-quarter strategies of the company changing, but I think you do have to review, reflect, and actually wonder, what is the nature of my company? What am I getting out of bed for? That is important. That's not puff, that's not marketing. That's a genuine conversation that we would like to have.
Exactly. I do agree with you that brand is not necessarily linked to scale. I do agree with you, and it depends on the individuals who are driving the DNA of that company. There are many small shipping companies and service providers out there that have a fantastic brand, and they do that from the very beginning. Alisdair being one of them. Tanko are based in Ireland, but their DNA from the very beginning was to have a face that matches the high brand. So the people within Alisdair took the view that they wanted that brand, and they have it. So I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily linked, but I think where it links up with the points made earlier is that some companies start off that journey not necessarily focusing on brand, and then they become big like Maersk did, and then they recognize when people like Klavs join them that actually we need to focus and invest money in that sphere, and then they do. And so I think that's where the distinction on scale comes in.
I think you mentioned earlier the panacea, if you like, is where the brand and reputation meet or marry. Is that something you strive to do within V.Group? Is that is reputation management important to you? Presumably it must be.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'd worked for a big brand that had a great reputation that was lost in seconds, and then part of a team to help to rebuild that reputation. So it's always there, and I think, to be fair to people in business that are making the commit, I mean, we talked about this earlier when we were having a little chat before this session. Probably should have recorded that because that was getting quite interesting. But this thing about commercialisation, and actually communications in itself needs to be seen to be commercial. Because if we talk about adding value to the bottom line, or delivering a better business outcome, so the reputation piece. So I'm seeing, and V.Group's going through an awful lot of transformation at the moment in the right way, because we're investing in that reputation. But it's not the typical measurements. The one thing that drives me to distraction in the communications industry, and has done for a very long time, is this: tell me how many hits on the website. Tell me how many people, and that was seen to be the only measure that we could give. You know, how many people have picked up a magazine with our advert in it? You know, who cares? It's not changed anything. But it becomes around, you know, applying net promoter scores. But behind that in itself is around the customer temperature. You know, what are you measuring? What's important to your customer? What's important to your employees? What's important to your suppliers? Again, it's all about this stakeholder piece. There's drivers of engagement for every single stakeholder. Do you know what they are, and are you measuring those? When I worked in the oil and gas industry, one of the measures from a communications perspective was the safety statistics. Because actually, in a change management process, my role was to ensure the organisation, if they did inflict any change on, and change is a constant, so but that's a different debate for a different day. But actually, if I asked and was part of a team helping somebody to do their job differently, and somebody didn't go home safely at the end of the day, we'd failed. Absolutely failed, regardless of any other measurement in place. So that's always, and again in the shipping industry, and that's the one thing, you know, in the V.Group, that's again a measure that I apply in my campaign planning, is did people go home safely? Are, you know, yeah, I mean, it runs deep into that. That's the measurement, and that's the reputational piece, because that's what would then promote that, you know, down to the net promoter score in terms of what your customer believes in you, and it's all back down to experience.
It is inherently different talking to a large multinational law firm compared to a two-ship company with 5 people employed. You know, they are going to behave very differently by their very nature. I think what I've seen is certainly that shift at the top end to a sort of a more corporatized process. But you know, as Mark rightly points out, I think what we're now seeing is, for all the advantages and that sort of step change that digital sort of tangibility offers, you know, it used to be a question of we'll put a message out there and see what sticks, you know, in the hope that, you know, a message, a print ad, a campaign of some description is going to get seen with no feedback loop whatsoever. Digital gives that the metrics that prove to a greater or lesser extent how effective you are being, but what they don't give is context. And I think that's the next step, as Mark said. It's that context of, okay, the numbers suggest this, but what does that actually mean? Just because somebody's clicking on something, does that necessarily mean they like it or not? And you know, that goes back to the fact that for all the sort of 96.7% of global trade that is seaborne, for all the sort of 9,000 ship-owning companies globally, we're a fairly small, very well-connected series of sectors. You know, I travel internationally every year through the major shipping centres of the world. I see the same people, year in, year out. You know, it waxes and wanes and it changes, but broadly speaking, that lion's share of seaborne trade is controlled by a fairly dense number of offices and people within those offices. And even within those sort of Venn diagrams of the people that sort of control those things, there's a sort of select few of the people that you actually want to talk to in terms of the key decision makers and those that are actually responsible. So I think we lose a little bit of focus if we are only relying on the tools that digital offers and this corporatized approach to getting the communications out. I completely appreciate what Maersk did in terms of the leadership role in changing that perception of what you can do. And I think it's very interesting you saying that the internal and the external are one and the same thing, because I think that probably hasn't translated particularly well in terms of the pretenders to Maersk, because many people have seen what Maersk did and then sort of tried to do it and didn't quite hit the mark in some respects. But I think we are getting back to that stage of that conversation. It's a slightly more focused conversation, but then it always was. I think we've gone sort of full scale, and it's now about being able to pick up the phone or one of many other channels, and to be able to get the right person and ask the right questions. And there's a lot to be said for face-to-face meetings still in the digital age.
Can I get another comment in just before that one?
Yes, sir.
Because I really like the comment from before about human to human. I just want to say that I actually think that I like brand plays as much of a role in B2B as it does in B2B in B2C, and just to make it very practical. So in Maersk, for instance, so if you have a company of, 25,000 people around the world, and you have your leadership talking about the strategy and what the company wants to be in various press and the various leadership conferences. And if you then have your account managers in Argentina giving a completely different experience to what leadership says, and they are only accepting, premium cargo, and then you have their colleagues in Australia cutting prices, then all of a sudden you have a huge disconnect. So, so the power of brand really lies in that aligned experience, and it's in B2B as much as in B2C, very quickly you can sort of undermine it with that consistent experience you want to give, according to that. I saw it a number of times in Maersk, and Maersk is by no means perfect in exercising the brand on a daily basis. Now, so in terms of, sorry, coming back to your question, sorry, Alisdair. I would say in terms of sort of measuring, I think it's extremely important to, or what we're trying to do in GE is certainly to have a very, let's say, a holistic way of reporting. So both look at sort of how the message is coming through both internally and externally. And set up mechanisms to do so both quantitatively and quantitatively. So you can do a lot with the numbers, as you say, Richard. So you can really, I think it's very important that you build sort of a hierarchy of what it is that you want to get out of it. So okay, do you just want what is that exactly you want to measure? Okay, do you just want to measure things are getting through? Okay, then we can look at click rates and whatever. But where it really becomes, trickier is when you move up the pyramid and you really want to see, okay, are you actually changing behaviors? And you can't do that with, SurveyMonkey tools or whatever.
Yeah.
You need to speak to people. You need in-depth brand surveys. You need peer market, deep market research to really see, okay, is there, if you really wanted to be seen as the thought leader of our industry, which GE typically wants to do in all the industries it plays, then that takes time.
I think there's not a great understanding of the multifaceted nature of reputation management, of actually understanding who you are trying to communicate with, of understanding what their mindset is, what's actually motivating them, and how you are relevant to them and how you want to influence their behaviour to your benefit. A lot of it is kind of like, okay, right, well, we were talking earlier, Yvonne, your media distribution list is absolutely massive, and you press a button, it's sometimes, it's sort of let's see what lands, rather than the targeted, focused way of, again, understanding why you want to have an impact on the market. And then from a communications perspective, there are a lot of buzzwords that I've noticed in shipping fly around. Clive was getting tremendously excited about content marketing as though this is some tremendously new thing, despite the fact that it's been going on for 120 years. We're hearing sort of influencer marketing and obviously everything being pushed through kind of social and digital. But the reality is it's just about it's understanding how you are relevant to that market, what you are doing, and creating content, real assets, that don't sort of, it's not about selling products, it's about education. And I think whatever channel that you're pushing through, the messaging has to be right, but you have to be telling people something interesting that will make them sit up and think, okay, I want to have a conversation with you, I want to engage, and back to Richard's point of people sort of flying out with press releases and sure we're guilty, but solutions and that kind of thing. And it is about cutting to the truths of actually what you're trying to do and communicating on that level.